The dust of Persia clung to the horizon like a veil, and in that haze rode the man who had shattered empires and defied every limit placed upon mortal ambition. Alexander, son of Philip, crowned in victory after victory, advanced deeper into a land that had once seemed untouchable. Yet for all the brilliance of his campaigns, for all the aura of invincibility that cloaked his name, destiny does not always declare its dangers in thunder. Sometimes it whispers in hidden valleys, in the quiet maneuvers of enemies who refuse to accept defeat. And it was in this fragile moment, in the shadow of a crumbling Achaemenid empire, that 40,000 Persians prepared a trap so precise, so sudden, that it very nearly ended not only his conquest but his life. To understand the weight of this moment, one must step into the world as it was in 330 BCE. Persia was not yet fully conquered. Its great king, Darius III, though broken and abandoned, still lived. Alexander's armies, hardened from years of relentless campaigning across Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, now marched into the Persian heartlands. Every step carried them closer to the fabled capitals of Persepolis and Ecbatana, the very symbols of Achaemenid glory. The men were tired, but victory had a way of sharpening their endurance. What they did not know, what even Alexander himself could not fully predict, was that the road ahead concealed dangers far greater than the exhaustion of long marches. In the jagged mountain passes and hidden valleys of Persia, local satraps and commanders rallied what remained of their forces, driven less by loyalty to Darius than by the primal desire to resist the invader who had toppled their world. The air of inevitability that surrounded Alexander's victories made his enemies desperate. They could not hope to meet him on open plains, where the phalanx stood immovable and the companion cavalry shattered wings of armies like storms breaking upon cliffs. Instead, they sought shadows, terrain, and cunning. Persian resistance began to adopt a different face. The ambush, the surprise strike, the dagger hidden in the dark. In these tactics lay the only chance of halting his momentum, and it was one such plan, woven from desperation, knowledge of the land, and sheer audacity, that nearly succeeded. Alexander himself was no stranger to danger. He had led charges at the Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela, always at the front, always risking death where lesser kings would have hidden behind walls of soldiers. His courage inspired, but it also exposed him. His companions, fiercely loyal yet human, could not shield him from every blade, and fate, that silent arbiter of kings, seemed to stalk him with equal fascination and menace. In the ambush of 330 BCE, it would test him like never before. The trap was laid in a stretch of terrain deceptively beautiful, narrow valleys framed by mountains, their slopes dotted with rocks and brush that could conceal thousands. The Persians knew that Alexander's column, stretched thin from days of marching, would have to pass through. They had studied his habits, his tendency to press forward, his reliance on speed and boldness. Here, they believed, they could shatter his army in one blow, decapitate the Macedonian command, and turn back the tide of conquest. To strike Alexander was not merely to win a battle. It was to break the myth of his invincibility, to show the world that the young Macedonian was flesh and blood, vulnerable to the same chaos that had undone countless conquerors before him. What makes this moment so haunting is not only how close they came, but how fragile the line between triumph and disaster truly was. History remembers Alexander as unstoppable, yet in this valley, among 40,000 determined Persians, he very nearly fell. Had the ambush succeeded, the story of the ancient world would have been rewritten. No march to India, no burning of Persepolis, no blending of East and West under his empire, only the memory of a young king cut down in the prime of his ambition. It is here, on the eve of this confrontation, that we glimpse the strange duality of history. The grandeur of empires balanced on the edge of accidents, the destiny of nations swayed by a few heartbeats of chaos. Alexander rode forward with his companions, unaware that shadows gathered above him. The Persians waited, tense and silent, their bows strung, their blades sharp, their orders clear. The valley would soon erupt into fire, and in that eruption the fate of the conqueror would be decided. But to grasp how this ambush nearly claimed his life, we must step back and understand the forces that brought it into being. The fall of Darius had left a vacuum, but vacuums rarely remain empty. Satraps like Ariobarzanes of Persis and Bessus of Bactria rose with defiance, unwilling to let their lands be swallowed without a fight. Alexander's march through Persia was not a victory parade. It was a gauntlet of resistance, a struggle against geography and human will. Every mountain pass, every stretch of desert, every city could conceal betrayal. The Macedonian army advanced with shields polished by triumph, but they marched into a landscape alive with enemies who had nothing left to lose. In this tension lies the opening act of the ambush. It was more than a military maneuver. It was a clash of psychology, of desperation against confidence, of shadows against the brilliance of daylight. The Persians, gathering in secret, knew their chance might never come again. Alexander, bold and unyielding, trusted in his speed and his gods, believing destiny favored him. Yet destiny, as the valley would reveal, is never so easily tamed. The horse's hooves struck the earth in steady rhythm as Alexander's column entered the narrowing terrain. Dust rose in clouds, the sun glared from above, and silence seemed to cling unnaturally to the slopes. The Persians watched from their concealed positions, thousands of eyes fixed on the invaders. The signal had not yet been given, but when it came, it would unleash a storm. Arrows would blot the sky, rocks would crash upon the marching troops, and warriors would pour from the cliffs in a sudden flood. It would be a moment of pure chaos, and in chaos even the greatest commanders can fall. In that valley, Alexander rode at the head, his plumed helmet glinting, his gaze fixed forward, his thoughts perhaps already reaching beyond the mountains to the treasures of Persepolis. He could not see the Persians hidden above, but history tells us he sensed danger. He was never blind to threat. His instincts, honed from years of peril, often guided him where reason failed. Yet even he could not fully predict what was about to unfold. The stage was set, the trap was drawn tight, and the young king stood at the brink of disaster. And so begins the tale of how 40,000 Persians nearly stopped Alexander the Great. It is a story of ambition and resistance, of cunning and near catastrophe. It reminds us that even the most legendary figures of history walked a razor's edge between life and death, between triumph and ruin. The valley waited, the Persians held their breath, and Alexander's destiny hung in the balance. The silence that pressed upon the valley was not born of peace, but of preparation. High above the Macedonian column, Persians crouched in shadows, their hands steady upon spear and bow. Yet to understand how they came to be there, poised to strike at the most feared conqueror of their age, we must look beyond the valley walls to the shattered empire that still fought desperately to resist him. Only months before, Darius III had fled the battlefield of Gaugamela. That day, the great king of Persia had watched his empire unravel in the dust, the once mighty host of the Achaemenids scattered before the disciplined phalanx and the thunderous charge of Macedonian cavalry. Darius had abandoned his chariot, had abandoned even the trappings of kingship, fleeing eastward into the lands of Media and Bactria. In his absence, the empire that had stood for 2 centuries, stretching from the Aegean to the Indus, began to fracture. Satraps, those regional governors who ruled vast territories, were left to decide whether to submit or resist. Submission was tempting. Alexander had proven himself generous to those who bowed without struggle. Cities that opened their gates were often spared, their elites integrated into the machinery of his expanding empire. Yet for others, resistance was more than pride. It was necessity. To surrender meant disgrace, the end of ancestral power, the humiliation of bowing to a foreign boy who claimed divine descent. Among those who chose resistance were men hardened by years of rule, who knew their land, their people, and their terrain better than any invader could. One such figure was Ariobarzanes, satrap of Persis. His realm lay at the very heart of Persia, in the mountains and valleys leading toward Persepolis, jewel of the empire. To him, surrender was unthinkable. His duty was not only to Darius, but to the legacy of Cyrus and Xerxes, to the memory of generations who had once ruled as masters of the world. He gathered what forces he could, remnants of defeated armies, local levies, and loyal retainers. Numbers alone could not rival the Macedonians in open battle, but Ariobarzanes understood something Alexander did not. Terrain could be a weapon as deadly as any sword. It was not only Ariobarzanes who plotted. In the east, Bessus, satrap of Bactria, began to fashion his own schemes. He would later seize Darius himself, betray him, and proclaim himself king. But for now, he watched Alexander's advance and measured opportunities. Persia was in chaos, yet chaos breeds both ruin and resistance. Across the empire, scattered groups of soldiers, tribesmen, and loyalists began to coalesce around leaders who refused to accept defeat. The ambush that nearly killed Alexander was not the act of a single man, but of this collective desperation. It was conceived from the recognition that conventional warfare was lost. The Macedonian phalanx was too disciplined, the companion cavalry too devastating, the charisma of Alexander too unifying for his men. But narrow valleys, ambushes, and sudden strikes could disrupt order, could strip away the advantages of discipline, and perhaps, just perhaps, create the moment needed to end him. For Alexander, the march into Persia was both triumphal and perilous. He was no longer simply the Macedonian king. He was becoming something larger. In Egypt, he had been hailed as son of Zeus Ammon. In Babylon, he had inherited the palaces of Nebuchadnezzar. The aura of divinity clung to him, and he embraced it. Yet, with each step deeper into Persia, he stretched his supply lines, burdened his men with exhaustion, and courted dangers that no prophecy could fully shield him from. The Macedonian army moved like a living organism, its core still the phalanx, men trained to fight as one, shields overlapping, spears projecting in disciplined rows. Around them marched mercenaries, archers, and cavalry, each component sharpened by years of war. But armies, no matter how disciplined, are vulnerable when stretched thin in mountain passes. A column can only move in narrow files. Cavalry cannot charge. Infantry cannot form their deadly wall. In such places, the advantage belongs to the ambusher, not the conqueror. The Persians knew this. They watched Alexander's route and chose their ground carefully. The valley they selected was narrow, with steep sides that funneled travelers into a confined path. It was a place where 40,000 men could be hidden in ridges and slopes, unseen until the signal was given. Arrows could rain from above, rocks could be loosed to tumble down upon marching troops, and sudden charges could break the column into fragments. It was a hunter's snare, waiting for its prey. What makes the moment so compelling is how close the Persians came to success. For all his brilliance, Alexander was not omniscient. He pressed forward, eager to seize Persepolis before its treasures could be spirited away. His focus on speed, the very quality that had brought him so many victories, became a vulnerability. The Persians exploited it ruthlessly, timing their ambush for the moment when his army was least prepared, when fatigue dulled senses and terrain hemmed them in. As the Macedonians entered the valley, the Persians lay silent, their numbers vast. Accounts suggest 40,000 men were assembled, veterans of earlier battles, local levies, mountain tribesmen skilled in sudden attacks. Their commanders had drilled them in secrecy, in discipline of their own. No sound, no movement until the order was given. Above, the sun cast long shadows across the rocks, masking figures that lay in wait. Below, Alexander rode at the head of his column, his companion cavalry close at hand, the phalanx stretching behind. What thoughts passed through his mind in those moments? Did he sense the stillness, the eerie absence of shepherds or travelers in a land usually alive with life? Did the instincts that had carried him through countless dangers whisper a warning? Or was his mind already upon Persepolis, envisioning the flames that would soon consume the palace of Xerxes? We cannot know, but we do know that fate was drawing tight its snare around him. The Persians had calculated everything: the terrain, the element of surprise, the concentration of their strike. It was no reckless charge, but a plan meant to decapitate the Macedonian leadership at once. To kill Alexander was to end the invasion. Without him, the army would splinter. His generals, brilliant though they were, often quarreled. His men followed him not only from loyalty but from awe. Remove Alexander, and the entire edifice of conquest might collapse. It is here that the story acquires its tension. The greatest conqueror of his age, perhaps of any age, walked unknowingly into a trap that had the power to end him. His enemies, though defeated on open battlefields, found in desperation the courage to strike one last blow. And history itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether destiny would favor the Macedonian or the land he sought to subdue. The valley narrowed. The walls rose higher. The dust of thousands of marching feet filled the air. The silence above remained unbroken, but in that silence, death crouched. The Persians waited for the signal, their hearts pounding, their eyes fixed on the figure of Alexander glinting in the sun. They had failed before, but here they believed the gods themselves had granted them a chance. One cry, one released arrow, one sudden rush, and the boy king would fall. What happened next would decide not only the fate of a man, but the course of civilizations. The valley tightened around the Macedonian column like the jaws of some immense, unseen predator. And yet Alexander pressed forward with the calm confidence of a man who had always found fortune at his side. His life to this point had been a cascade of triumphs so improbable that even he began to believe destiny itself was his companion. To his soldiers, he was more than king. He was a figure blessed by gods, a man whose survival in countless battles seemed to defy mortality. But on that narrow road beneath the gaze of thousands of hidden enemies, the question arose with renewed force. Was Alexander truly favored by the divine, or was he about to learn that even the chosen of heaven could bleed? Alexander's faith in his own destiny was not mere arrogance. From his childhood, he had been told he was different, set apart. His mother, Olympias, whispered of his descent from Achilles, the great hero of Homeric legend. His father, Philip, had built a kingdom that placed him at the forefront of Greece, but Alexander was taught that his inheritance extended beyond Greece, beyond Persia, to the ends of the earth itself. The visit to the oracle of Zeus Ammon at Siwa in Egypt only deepened this belief. There, he was greeted not as mortal, but as son of the god. When he rode now through the valleys of Persia, he did so with the conviction that his path was ordained. But conviction can blind as well as guide. To believe oneself chosen is to risk underestimating the dangers that stalk unseen. For all his brilliance, Alexander carried within him a vulnerability. The assumption that destiny would never desert him. He had survived wounds that would have killed other men. He had crossed rivers, deserts, and mountains where armies should have perished, yet his banners still flew. Fortune had always bent to his will. The Persians hiding in the crags above hoped to break that illusion in a single instant. Consider the tension of that moment from their eyes. To them, Alexander was no man but a storm, a force that swept away armies, cities, and kings. They had seen Darius flee, had heard tales of cities surrendering without a fight, of satraps bending the knee. Yet here was their chance to pierce the myth. In the silence before the strike, Persian commanders whispered prayers to Ahura Mazda, the great god of light, begging for strength to cut down the invader. They were not fools. They knew their cause was desperate, but desperation sharpens resolve. To kill Alexander was not merely a military act, but a cosmic rebalancing. The arrogance of this Macedonian youth, claiming divine descent, would be shattered by a well-placed arrow or the thrust of a spear. The valley to both sides became more than terrain. It was an altar where fate itself would be tested. Alexander rode at the head of his companions, the men who had followed him from Macedon, who had seen him strike down Persian nobles with his own hand. These men were bound to him by bonds of loyalty and awe. They watched him constantly, taking courage from his fearlessness. Yet even they must have felt unease as the shadows lengthened on the slopes. It is said that soldiers often sense danger before commanders acknowledge it. Perhaps murmurs ran down the line, the instinctive shiver that comes when eyes unseen follow from above. Alexander, though bold, was not reckless without thought. His genius lay as much in instinct as in planning. He read battlefields like poets read verses, sensing patterns invisible to others. Did he notice the unnatural stillness of the valley? The absence of shepherds, the strange silence of birds? Ancient writers hint that he did. Some suggest he paused, ordered scouts to ride ahead and tested the ground. Others believe he pressed on, unwilling to delay, driven by the urgency of seizing Persepolis before its treasures could be hidden or destroyed. Whatever the truth, the moment hung suspended. Danger crouched above, destiny rode below, and the breath of history seemed caught between the two. For Alexander, danger had always carried a strange allure. He was no distant general directing battles from safety. He led from the front, charging into the thick of combat, his very presence igniting his men. Time and again this recklessness brought him to the brink of death. At the Granicus, he had nearly been cut down by Persian nobles, saved only by the intervention of Clytus the Black. At Issus and Gaugamela, he had hurled himself at the heart of the enemy line, seeking not safety, but glory. Each escape reinforced the belief that he could not fall. Yet in that valley, the danger was different. It was not a duel of champions or the clash of armies, but the sudden, impersonal violence of ambush. An arrow from above, a stone loosed from the cliffs. These were not honors of combat, but the faceless hand of death. Even heroes can be undone when fate wears no face. The Persians understood this. Their plan was to sever the head of the serpent. The first volleys of arrows would target the front of the column, striking Alexander and his companions before the army could react. Cavalry hidden in gullies would rush down to finish the work, while infantry blocked the path ahead and behind. It was a noose designed not to fight a battle, but to execute a king. And yet, Alexander carried with him not only his companions, but also the weight of myth. His men believed in his invincibility. They had seen him survive wounds, seen him emerge from battles where death had seemed certain. To them, his survival was proof of divine favor. In moments of crisis, this faith could be as powerful as steel. A soldier who believes his king cannot fall will fight with a ferocity that defies calculation. It was this psychological armor, as much as bronze and iron, that shielded Alexander on his campaigns. In the hush before the ambush, the valley itself seemed to hold its breath. Dust settled on the armor of the phalanx. Horses stamped nervously, perhaps sensing what men did not. The Persians, motionless, waited for the command that would unleash chaos. One cry, one trumpet, one falling rock would transform silence into storm. Alexander's plumed helmet gleamed in the sunlight, a beacon that drew every eye above. The Persians tightened their grips, knowing that within moments they might change the course of history. For what is history but a series of narrow escapes, of moments when the balance tips one way instead of another? Had the Persians struck true, the Macedonian dream would have collapsed. Without Alexander, there would be no empire stretching to India, no fusion of East and West, no legacy that would echo through Rome and beyond. In his place, Persia might have risen once more, battered but unbroken. The ambush was not merely a military gamble, it was a turning point where two futures clashed in silence, awaiting release. And in this silence, the mind of Alexander burned with the same intensity that had driven him since youth. To him, the world was not infinite but conquerable. Every mountain pass was not a barrier, but a challenge. He did not see himself as a man walking into danger, but as the instrument of fate itself, chosen to spread his rule to the ends of the earth. Whether or not he sensed the Persians, he rode with the unshakable belief that no valley, no ambush, no enemy could halt him. The Persians prepared to test that belief. The valley was set, the noose drawn tight. Above, warriors whispered prayers. Below, soldiers marched with unease. And at the center of it all, Alexander rode, radiant and vulnerable, the axis upon which the destiny of continents turned. The silence broke, not with a trumpet nor with a cry, but with the sudden hiss of arrows slicing through the air. From the cliffs above, black shafts rained down, their iron heads glinting for an instant before they buried themselves in flesh and shield. Macedonian soldiers stumbled, cries of pain rising as the first ranks collapsed beneath the invisible storm. The calm order of the column shattered in a heartbeat. Boulders tumbled from the slopes, loosed by Persian hands. They crashed down upon the narrow path, smashing men and horses alike, splintering shields and breaking bones with the force of falling thunder. The phalanx, that great engine of war, could not form in such confinement. Their long spears were useless against enemies who struck from above and then disappeared behind rock and scrub. In the confusion, men raised shields against the sky, but for every arrow they blocked, another found its mark. Alexander was at the front when it began. His horse reared beneath the storm of missiles, and for a heartbeat the young king was exposed, his plumed helmet a target for 100 bowstrings. Arrows clattered against his shield, one glanced off his breastplate, another tore through the crest of his helmet. Companions crowded close, shields raised, spears thrust upward in futile defiance of the unseen assailants. Yet still the Persians loosed their volleys, each one seeking the life of the man who had undone their empire. The trap had sprung perfectly. From gullies and hidden paths, Persian infantry poured down, their war cries echoing across the valley. They struck at the flanks of the column, hacking into the disordered Macedonians. Cavalry rushed from concealed positions, charging at the rear to sever retreat. In an instant, Alexander's army was hemmed in on all sides. The road ahead was blocked, the way behind closed, the cliffs above alive with death. Panic rippled through the Macedonian ranks. Soldiers who had marched through deserts and crossed rivers felt terror gnaw at their resolve. Here, their discipline faltered. Some tried to push forward, others to retreat, while arrows continued to fall. The tight formation that had won Issus and Gaugamela could not be maintained. They were prey in a killing ground, and the hunters pressed their advantage with ruthless precision. In the midst of the chaos, Alexander's figure shone like fire. He did not retreat, nor did he hide. With a cry that cut through the din, he rallied his companions and spurred his horse into the thick of the enemy charge. Spears clashed, swords rang, and the young king fought not as a commander, but as a warrior, his blade flashing, his voice urging his men to stand firm. Around him the companions formed a living wall, each man willing to die before letting harm reach their king. Yet death brushed close. A Persian noble lunged from the melee, spear leveled at Alexander's chest. The thrust was swift, deadly. But one of the companions intercepted, driving his own blade into the attacker before the spear could strike true. Another arrow tore through the air, grazing Alexander's arm, drawing blood. The king fought on, wounded but unyielding, his presence a beacon that steadied his men even as the noose tightened. The battle became a storm of confusion. Macedonian soldiers scrambled up the slopes, trying to dislodge the archers, but the terrain favored the defenders. For every man who climbed, 3 Persians waited above with stones and spears. The valley floor became a slaughterhouse. Horses screamed, men fell, the air thick with dust and blood. The Persians pressed their advantage, certain that this day would be the day the invincible Alexander finally fell. But even in the jaws of death, Alexander's genius revealed itself. He saw that to remain trapped in the valley was certain ruin. The army had to break free to carve a path through the encirclement before the Persians could finish their work. With a voice that carried above the din, he ordered his companions to form tight and charge uphill, directly at the point where the enemy line seemed weakest. It was madness, it was impossible, and yet his men obeyed. The companions spurred forward, their charge like a spear thrust into the heart of the trap. Shields locked, lances leveled, they surged up the slope. Alexander himself rode at the front, his horse crashing into the Persian ranks, his spear finding its mark again and again. The Persians, caught off guard by the ferocity of the counterattack, wavered. For the first time, the noose loosened. Behind him, the phalanx began to reform. Despite the carnage, the discipline of Macedon endured. Step by step, shield by shield, they pressed forward, turning chaos into cohesion. Archers returned fire, slingers hurled stones upward, and slowly, painfully, the army pushed back against the trap. The valley that had been a slaughterhouse became a battlefield once more. Still, the danger was not gone. At any moment, Alexander might have fallen, and with him, all resistance would have collapsed. His horse was struck beneath him, collapsing in agony. The king leapt clear, seizing another mount from a fallen companion, never ceasing his assault. Blood streaked his armor, dust clung to his face, but his eyes blazed with the fury of survival. Every swing of his blade carried not only his own fate, but that of his entire empire. The Persians pressed, but their cohesion began to falter. The ambush, so carefully laid, depended on shock and rapid victory. Yet Alexander's defiance, his refusal to fall, disrupted the rhythm. Each failed attempt to kill him eroded their certainty. The Macedonians, rallying around their king, turned panic into resolve. Slowly, the tide shifted. What had seemed certain death became a desperate struggle for life, and in that struggle, the invaders clawed their way toward survival. Hours passed like an eternity in that valley. The ground was littered with the dead, the cries of the wounded mingling with the clash of steel. Alexander fought as though possessed, his very survival a defiance of fate. Again and again death reached for him, a spear thrust, an arrow's flight, the swing of a sword, and again he slipped free, shielded by loyalty, by skill, perhaps even by the favor of gods. By the time the sun dipped toward the horizon, the Persians had lost their advantage. Their ambush, once so perfect, had unraveled against the sheer will of Alexander and his men. The Macedonians had broken through the trap, seizing high ground, driving back their attackers. The Persians, exhausted and disheartened, began to retreat, their dream of ending the conqueror shattered. The valley was won, but at a terrible cost. Thousands lay dead, Macedonian and Persian alike. The ground was slick with blood, the air heavy with smoke and dust. Alexander stood among the survivors, his armor dented, his body wounded, his eyes fierce. He had come closer to death that day than ever before. The ambush had nearly ended him, nearly ended everything, but fortune, or fate, had carried him through. As darkness fell, the Macedonians lit their fires, the flicker of flames casting long shadows upon the corpses that lined the valley floor. They had survived, but the memory of that day would never leave them. They had seen their king stand on the knife's edge between life and death, had felt the world nearly collapse around them. To them, his survival was proof beyond doubt. Alexander was no mere man, but one favored by the gods. Yet for Alexander himself, the lesson was different. He had seen how fragile destiny could be, how even the greatest plans could be undone in a moment of chaos. He had felt the hand of death brush his shoulder, and though he would march on, though he would burn Persepolis and conquer further still, the valley would remain a reminder that even the son of Zeus Ammon was not beyond the reach of mortality. The Persian horsemen surged forward in a tide of dust and steel, their riders' cries echoing like a storm rolling across the dry valley. Arrows whistled down from ridges on either side, darkening the sunlight for a moment as if the heavens themselves had joined in striking Alexander. The Macedonian phalanx tightened, shields raised, sarissas leveled in a deadly bristle of spear points. The air was heavy with the sound of galloping hooves, clashing bronze, and the thunder of men who knew that on this field hung the question of life or death. Alexander, in the center of it all, was both commander and target. His horse Bucephalus strained against the reins, nostrils flared, sensing the chaos around him. The king's helmet gleamed in the harsh light, a beacon that drew Persian eyes and arrows alike. At such moments, his brilliance was also his danger. Every enemy archer, every sword raised in fury, sought him above all others. The Persians knew that to kill Alexander was to break the Macedonian spirit, to turn this army of steel into a scattering of frightened men. The trap had been carefully planned. The Persians had studied his movements, tracked the impatience with which he pursued broken enemies. They lured him into a narrow valley where their numbers could encircle him, hidden detachments waiting like coiled snakes among the rocks. As Alexander drove forward, their plan snapped shut with lethal precision. It was not the blundering panic of a defeated foe, but the deliberate calculation of commanders who had learned at last how to fight the man who seemed unstoppable. The first shock of contact was brutal. Macedonian cavalry, charging in their wedge formation behind Alexander, crashed headlong into the Persian line. Horses screamed, men toppled, the clang of iron against bronze rang across the valley. Yet the Persians did not break. They pressed in with grim determination, their spears thrusting, their numbers overwhelming. More poured down the slopes, hemming in the Macedonian horsemen, forcing them to fight on every side. For an instant, Alexander disappeared into the mass of bodies, swallowed by a swarm of enemies. His companions fought desperately to carve a circle around him, but the Persians pressed tighter, arrows rattling off shields, blades flashing in the dust-choked air. At one point, a Persian noble rode straight at him, spear aimed at his chest. Alexander parried with his own, the shafts shattering in splinters, then cut the man down in a brutal swing that split armor and bone. Yet for each foe who fell, more came, relentless, as if the valley itself birthed enemies without end. Behind him, the Macedonian infantry struggled to hold formation. The phalanx was built for open ground, for steady advance, not for sudden assault from cliffs and ridges. Still, their discipline held. Sarissas drove into onrushing cavalry, horses impaled, riders thrown screaming. The men fought not only for survival, but with the desperate knowledge that their king's life balanced on a knife's edge. And all the while, Alexander's gamble became clearer. His pursuit had driven him too far, his desire to finish what remained of Persian resistance, clouding the caution that had so often guided his strategies. He was in a position no conqueror wished to be, surrounded, outnumbered, and the very figure the enemy most hungered to strike down. Yet in that crucible of peril, something else emerged. His companions, hardened by years of campaign, formed a living shield around him. They fought with the ferocity of men bound not merely to a king, but to a legend they believed touched by the gods. To fall here would not simply be the death of Alexander, it would be the shattering of destiny itself. So they carved, they bled, they endured. Alexander, ever the gambler, pressed forward, not retreating but driving at the heart of the ambush, as though sheer audacity could split the trap open. Every decision, every movement was a balance between brilliance and disaster, and on this day, the difference was measured by inches and heartbeats. The valley became a furnace of struggle, a place where dust, sweat, and blood mingled into one. Men stumbled over the dead. Horses screamed as they went down under the weight of steel, and still the Persians closed. It was not yet clear if fate would favor the Macedonian king, or if, on this forgotten battlefield, history itself might have ended differently. A Persian javelin sliced the air and struck Alexander's shield with a thundering crack, the impact nearly wrenching the bronze from his grasp. He staggered for the briefest heartbeat, the weight of the blow numbing his arm, and in that instant another attacker surged forward, a curved blade flashing down toward his exposed neck. The Macedonian king twisted low in the saddle, the sword whistling past as Bucephalus reared with a shriek, hooves striking out at the enemy horse. It was a narrow escape, one among many that day, and each close brush with death drove home how precarious his situation truly was. The companions closed ranks, their formation bending inward like a clenched fist around their king. Hephaestion, his lifelong friend, fought near his side, driving his spear into a Persian rider who pressed too close. Clytus the Black, the grizzled veteran who had saved Alexander before on the banks of the Granicus, shouted orders and cut a path through the melee with savage precision. The circle of defenders shrank and expanded, pulsing with the rhythm of survival, but the Persians were relentless. Every time one wave broke, another came crashing in. From the ridges, archers loosed volley after volley, their shafts plunging down like rain from an unforgiving sky. Men fell with arrows in their throats, their faces, their lungs. Macedonian shields bristled with them, heavy as porcupine quills, but still the soldiers pressed forward. The noise was deafening, the metallic scream of clashing weapons, the guttural cries of men, the terrible shrieks of dying horses. Dust choked every breath, mixing with the iron tang of blood. Alexander knew that hesitation meant death. Instead of holding his ground, he spurred Bucephalus forward, spear in hand, driving straight into the thickest knot of Persian horsemen. It was the most dangerous course, but also the most audacious, the kind of move that had carried him from the plains of Issus to the gates of Babylon. He struck down the first rider in his path, then the second, each kill a wedge splitting the encirclement. The companions followed, their charge tearing into the Persian line with a force born of desperation. For a moment, the tactic worked. The sudden thrust startled the Persians, who had expected to see the Macedonians collapse inward. The line faltered, and Alexander pushed deeper, his men hacking, thrusting, shoving bodies aside as they carved a corridor through the press. But the enemy adapted quickly. Trumpets blared, and from both sides fresh cavalry poured down the slopes, slamming into the wedge. The narrow opening began to close once more, snapping shut like the jaws of a beast. It was then that disaster nearly struck. A Persian nobleman, his armor glittering with gold in the dusty light, locked eyes on Alexander. He lowered his spear, kicked his horse hard, and hurtled forward with murderous intent. Alexander, occupied with another rider, turned too late. The spear was already upon him, aimed at his chest, and in that instant history itself seemed poised to change. But Clytus, ever watchful, drove his own spear into the Persian's side, knocking him from the saddle in a spray of blood. The strike came a heartbeat before the weapon would have pierced Alexander. It was the second time Clytus had saved him from certain death, and in that narrow escape lay the fragile thread of destiny. The Macedonian king lived, though for a moment it had been as close as a breath, as fragile as a heartbeat. The Persians, frustrated that their prize still eluded them, redoubled their fury. They poured into the valley in greater numbers, determined to bury Alexander beneath weight of men, if not by single stroke. Yet in their fervor lay a weakness. The more they pressed inward, the tighter the press became, and the more difficult it was to maneuver. Horses stumbled over the fallen, men jammed together in choking knots of bodies. What had been their strength, the sheer crush of numbers, began to slow their assault. Alexander saw the shift. That moment when an enemy's confidence teetered into chaos, and he seized it. He shouted to his men, his voice cutting through the din, urging them to hold, to push, to drive forward one more time. The companions, their armor dented and slick with blood, roared in answer and threw their weight into the charge. Sarissa's thrust with renewed vigor, blades flashed in arcs of silver, and slowly, impossibly, the wedge began to move again. The phalanx, though battered, had not broken. At last their steady line caught up, their forest of spears anchoring the chaos. The infantry pressed forward with methodical precision, step by step, pushing the Persians back from the flanks. The trap, which had seemed so perfectly laid, began to fray at the edges. Macedonian discipline met Persian fury, and in that clash of opposites, the tide shifted. Still, the danger had not passed. The valley remained a cauldron, and Alexander's life balanced on the edge of every encounter. Each man who fell near him could have been the one to break the circle. Each arrow loosed could have been the one that pierced his heart. It was a battle fought not in grand maneuvers, but in the raw, grinding struggle of survival. And yet, as the sun dipped lower, the Persians began to waver. They had thrown their strength at Alexander, and had not broken him. The ambush that should have ended his campaign here in the dust of Persia had failed to achieve its single vital aim. The Macedonian king still lived, and as long as he breathed, his men believed no enemy could triumph. The question now was no longer whether Alexander would survive the day, but how he would turn this brush with death into another stepping stone on his path to immortality. The Persians began to scatter in uneven waves, their fury spent, their ranks fractured. What had begun as a carefully orchestrated trap dissolved into a desperate struggle to disengage. Horses wheeled back toward the ridges, men cast down broken spears and tried to flee into the barren hills. The thunderous charge that had seemed certain to crush Alexander now melted into a retreat, leaving the valley littered with the wreckage of men and beasts. Alexander did not immediately give chase. He reined in Bucephalus, his chest heaving with the exhaustion of combat, his armor streaked with blood, both his own and that of others. He raised his spear high, signaling his companions to halt and reform. Around him, men panted, their faces gray with dust, their shields scarred, their eyes still wild with the adrenaline of survival. Silence settled slowly, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the distant clatter of retreating Persians. It was then that the enormity of what had transpired began to sink in. The ambush had come closer to ending his campaign than any battle before it. At Issus, at Gaugamela, even at the perilous crossings of rivers under enemy fire, Alexander had faced the masses of Persia and prevailed with dazzling strategy. But here, in a nameless valley, he had nearly lost everything, not through a grand clash of armies, but through a sudden strike born of cunning and desperation. The irony was not lost on him. Great empires had fallen to him, yet his own life had nearly been extinguished by a single spear, a single heartbeat. His men looked to him, as they always did in such moments, searching for assurance that their ordeal had not been in vain. Alexander lifted his helmet, revealing a face streaked with sweat and grime, but his eyes were burning with the same fire that had carried him from Macedonia to the edge of the world. He called out words of triumph, not of fear, reminding his soldiers that they had faced the storm and endured. He told them that the gods had once more revealed their favor, that no ambush, however cunning, could undo the destiny that lay before them. In his voice was no trace of the doubt that had flickered in those desperate moments. In its place was the unshakable confidence of a man who believed himself chosen. The wounded were gathered, their cries echoing across the valley as surgeons moved swiftly with knives and fire to cut away arrowheads and cauterize gaping wounds. Fallen comrades were lifted onto shields, their bodies carried with reverence, for each death was a piece of the army's soul lost on foreign soil. Alexander walked among them, speaking to the injured, offering comfort where he could, ensuring that every man felt seen by his king. It was in these acts, as much as in battle, that his soldiers' devotion was bound to him. As night fell, campfires dotted the valley floor, their flickering light casting long shadows over the carnage. The Persian dead lay unburied, their bodies a grim reminder of ambition undone. Yet among Alexander's officers there was little relief. Hephaestion, Clytus, Parmenion, and others gathered in tense council, voices low but urgent. The ambush had revealed something troubling. The Persians were not yet broken, not yet resigned to defeat. Even without Darius, even with their empire fractured, they could still strike dangerously, and they had come perilously close to altering the course of history. Alexander listened, but his thoughts were elsewhere. In the quiet moments, he replayed the spear aimed at his chest, the nearness of death, the taste of mortality that even kings could not avoid. He thought of Achilles, who had been warned of his fate, yet embraced it for glory's sake. He wondered if he too was walking that same narrow path, where each victory brought him closer not to safety, but to the final blow destined to end him. And yet he felt no fear. If anything, the brush with death only hardened his resolve. If he was to fall, it would not be here, in a forgotten valley, but in the blaze of conquest that would be remembered for ages. When dawn broke, the Macedonian army rose not with despair, but with renewed determination. They had faced death and survived, and in their survival they found fresh strength. Alexander rode before them, his armor polished once more, his posture unshaken. He told them that Persia itself had conspired to destroy him and failed, and that this was proof of divine will guiding their cause. His words lifted the men, turned terror into pride, and transformed what might have been a disaster into yet another tale of triumph. The march continued, the valley fading behind them like a shadow that could not linger. Yet the memory of that ambush would not vanish. It became a quiet ghost in the Macedonian camp, whispered of at night, recalled in the pauses of long marches. Some saw it as a warning, a reminder that Alexander was mortal after all. Others saw it as confirmation that he was indeed favored by the gods, for what man could face such peril and emerge unscathed? In this way, the ambush was more than a battle. It was a test of destiny, a glimpse into the fragile line between glory and ruin. Alexander had nearly been lost, but in surviving he grew larger in the eyes of his men, a figure both mortal and divine, bound by fate yet seemingly untouchable. It was not the last time he would walk the edge of death, but it was among the closest, and it left its mark on all who were there. And as the army pressed deeper into the heart of Persia, the shadow of that day followed them, a constant reminder that every step forward was won not only with blood, but with the fragile mercy of fortune. The days following the ambush were marked not by the roaring chaos of battle, but by a tense, measured progression through the heart of Persia. The Macedonian army moved like a wounded but determined beast, aware that the valley had been a warning. The Persian spirit, though broken in many regions, still harbored cunning and lethal intent. Every ridge and pass was scrutinized, scouts pressed further ahead, and spies were sent to probe villages for signs of hidden forces. Alexander himself rode at the front, eyes sharp, hands on the hilt of his sword, every sense alert to threats both obvious and hidden. The ambush had left its imprint on the psyche of the men. Even the most seasoned companions, those who had laughed at death on the plains of Issus and the deserts of Syria, now rode with a new caution. They spoke in hushed tones of the valley where they had nearly been trapped and cut down. Stories circulated of arrows that had flown so close they had whispered past helmets, of rocks that had tumbled like falling mountains, of moments when even Alexander had almost been pierced by Persian steel. These accounts, though terrifying, only deepened their devotion. If their king could survive such peril, then survival was a matter of following his lead, of matching his audacity with courage tempered by discipline. Alexander, aware of the weight that nearly dying had placed upon him and his army, began to reflect differently on his strategies. The ambush revealed vulnerabilities he had not anticipated. Speed and surprise had served him well in countless campaigns, but here they had nearly led to catastrophe. He began to consider the balance between aggression and caution, weighing each march, each passage through a valley or city against the potential for hidden resistance. Yet he did not slow his pursuit. Rather, he adapted, sharpening his awareness while maintaining the momentum that had carried him from Macedon to the gates of Persepolis. Behind the army, the Persian resistance stirred. Ariobarzanes, Bessus, and other satraps watched the aftermath of their failed ambush with growing apprehension. Their gamble had come perilously close to success, and its failure now left them exposed. Morale among their ranks wavered. Men who had fought bravely in concealment now questioned whether they could stand against a foe whose survival seemed almost supernatural. Yet they were not completely broken. Completely, scattered forces regrouped in nearby valleys and ridges, waiting for new opportunities to strike, hoping for another chance to catch Alexander unawares. For Alexander, the ambush became a story of caution and revelation, one he used not only to learn, but to inspire. He spoke to his men of their narrow escape, emphasizing both the danger and their triumph. "We faced the hand of Persia in the shadows," he told them, "and it could not touch us. Fate favors those who act with courage, and today we have proven that courage can overcome even the greatest designs of our enemies." His words resonated, transforming fear into pride and uncertainty into resolve. As the Macedonians pressed forward, the lessons of the ambush manifested in practical measures. Scouts were doubled, positions were reconnoitered more carefully, and patrols were placed on every ridge. The army's pace slowed at critical points, formations adjusted to account for potential traps. Yet Alexander maintained the same driving urgency toward Persepolis, unwilling to allow fear to dictate strategy. The balance between caution and ambition became a defining element of the campaign from that point onward. The psychological impact extended beyond the army itself. Local populations who had witnessed the power of Persian resistance and the near miss against Alexander saw both the vulnerability and the invincibility of the invader. Tales of the ambush spread, exaggerating both the skill of the Persians and the near-mythic survival of the Macedonian king. In these stories, Alexander's reputation grew, blending historical reality with legend, reinforcing the image of a man who could survive the impossible. Meanwhile, Alexander himself reflected privately on mortality and fate. In the quiet hours of night, beside the flickering glow of campfires, he pondered the narrow margin by which his life had been spared. He had been a youth of unshakable confidence, believing himself almost untouchable. But the ambush reminded him that even he was not beyond the reach of death. This realization did not weaken him, it refined his perception of strategy and human limitation. From that moment, he would carry not only the fire of ambition, but also the tempered awareness that fortune, while often favoring him, could be fickle. The ambush thus became more than a battle. It was a crucible. Alexander had faced annihilation, tested the loyalty of his men, measured the resolve of his enemies, and emerged intact. In doing so, he not only survived but also solidified the psychological supremacy of the Macedonian army. The near-death experience transformed fear into cohesion, doubt into determination, and survival into legend. As the army advanced toward Persepolis, the shadow of the ambush remained, a reminder of the thin line between triumph and catastrophe. Alexander's path continued, shaped in part by the lessons learned in that narrow valley. His strategy became sharper, his awareness more acute, and his mythos more profound. The story of the 40,000 Persians who almost ended his campaign would echo through the centuries. a testament to both the perils of ambition and the fragile hand of fate that even a god-touched conqueror could not entirely escape. The valley receded behind them, but its memory endured. In the minds of Alexander and his men, it became a symbol of danger, of survival, of the thin thread by which history can pivot. And as they marched onward deeper into Persia, every step carried the weight of that near tragedy, a quiet tension beneath the drive of conquest that would culminate in the burning of Persepolis and the sweeping changes Alexander would impose across the ancient world. Following the fall of Persepolis, Alexander faced a new set of challenges. The city's conquest had cemented his control over the Persian heartland, yet pockets of resistance persisted, satraps and nobles still capable of organizing forces to strike back. The ambush in the valley, though months passed, continued to influence every decision. Alexander knew that even a single unforeseen attack could unravel months of progress, and the Macedonians, hardened by the near-death experience, were vigilant. Scouts combed the plains, cavalry patrolled potential ambush sites, and infantry formations were adjusted to respond swiftly to surprise threats. As the army moved eastward, pursuing remnants of Persian forces, Alexander's leadership became a study in the integration of experience and audacity. He pressed forward with characteristic speed, yet every move was calculated, informed by the lessons of the valley. He established observation posts on ridges, sent small detachments to probe villages, and monitored supply lines meticulously. The ambush had revealed the danger of complacency. No terrain was safe, no enemy underestimated. Every step of the campaign became both an assertion of dominance and a test of preparedness. Persian resistance grew increasingly fragmented. Satraps like Bessus and Nabarzanes attempted to regroup, relying on the vast distances of their empire to shield themselves. Yet Alexander's forces, guided by the dual lessons of boldness and caution, moved with relentless precision. Ambushes were anticipated and neutralized before they could threaten the Macedonian vanguard. Cavalry maneuvers became sharper, infantry formations more flexible, and scouts provided continuous intelligence. The army operated with the confidence born of experience tempered by the memory of peril. Psychologically, the Macedonians were transformed. The near-death experience in the valley had forged a deeper bond between the soldiers and their king. Each man understood that survival depended on discipline and cohesion, and the memory of the ambush reinforced this awareness. Tales circulated in the camps of Alexander's audacity, his composure under mortal threat, and the brilliance of his maneuvers. These stories became a form of psychological warfare against remaining Persian forces, amplifying fear and undermining morale before engagement even began. Alexander himself grew increasingly aware of the interplay between legend and reality. The ambush had been a near miss in the literal sense, yet its effects extended far beyond the battlefield. It had made him cautious where previously he might have been reckless, attentive where previously he might have trusted fortune alone. His strategies now reflected an intricate balance, calculated risk, rapid execution, and a deep understanding of human behavior. Command was exercised not only through orders but through perception, projecting invincibility while respecting the limits of mortality. As the campaign pressed further into eastern Persia, remaining Persian forces attempted sporadic resistance. Yet Alexander's mastery of terrain, awareness of enemy psychology, and the cohesive discipline of his army rendered these attempts increasingly ineffective. Each encounter was swift, decisive, and calculated to minimize Macedonian losses while asserting dominance. The memory of the ambush ensured that Alexander never underestimated the enemy, and the Macedonians, having survived their closest brush with annihilation, fought with heightened alertness and unity. Beyond military considerations, the ambush shaped Alexander's relationship with the cities and regions he conquered. He approached diplomacy and governance with strategic foresight, wary of hidden threats, yet confident in the authority and aura his survival had cultivated. Local leaders recognized both his brilliance and the near-mythical aura surrounding him, understanding that the king who had survived 40,000 Persian strikes in a single valley was not merely a conqueror, but a figure seemingly favored by fate. Compliance often followed as a choice between pragmatic submission and inevitable defeat. Through these months of consolidation, the story of the ambush continued to echo within the army and across Persia. It became a reference point for both leadership and courage, a tale illustrating the thin line between triumph and disaster. Soldiers internalized the lesson that even the most legendary commander could face mortal danger, and that vigilance, discipline, and loyalty were as vital as bravery and strength. For the Persian resistance, the legend of survival worked as a psychological weapon, amplifying fear and reinforcing the inevitability of Alexander's advance. In this way, the ambush's significance extended far beyond the valley where it occurred. It had altered Alexander's tactics, refined the army's cohesion, shaped the perception of invincibility, and influenced the strategic landscape of Persia itself. What could have been a disaster became a tool of learning, a crucible in which both man and army were forged stronger, wiser, and more attuned to the delicate balance between mortality and destiny. And as the Macedonians continued their relentless push, the shadow of the ambush remained, a silent guiding reminder of vulnerability and resilience, a measure of mortality and courage that would shape every engagement, every decision, and the legend of Alexander the Great for generations to come. The eastern provinces of the Persian Empire lay ahead, vast stretches of arid plains, rugged mountains, and fortified cities. By now, the Macedonian army had internalized the lessons of the ambush so thoroughly that even in unfamiliar territory, every movement was measured. Alexander understood that victory was no longer assured by boldness alone. Intelligence, adaptability, and the careful assessment of terrain and enemy disposition were equally essential. His officers, attuned to the rhythm of near disaster, coordinated closely, balancing initiative with adherence to strategy. As they advanced, sporadic Persian resistance emerged. Small garrisons, hastily assembled militias, and local satraps testing Alexander's resolve. Each engagement became a study in anticipation and reaction. The army operated like a single organism, infantry and cavalry complementing each other. Scouts providing continuous updates, engineers preparing for obstacles before they became threats. The memory of the valley ambush dictated every choice. Never assume the enemy is defeated, never allow complacency to creep into even the smallest action. Alexander himself became a figure both mortal and mythic. He moved among his men, addressing concerns, inspecting camps, and demonstrating that vigilance was as essential as courage. Soldiers spoke of how he had survived the valley, how he had faced arrows, spears, and overwhelming numbers and emerged unscathed. These stories were shared from campfires to city gates, reinforcing loyalty and amplifying his aura of invincibility. The psychological dimension of warfare, fear, awe, and reverence had become as vital as the clash of swords and spears. Persian forces, now fractured and leaderless in many regions, struggled to mount effective resistance. Bessus and other commanders attempted to regroup in remote fortresses, but the Macedonian advance was relentless. Cavalry scouts intercepted couriers, skirmishes were crushed before they could swell into ambushes, and Alexander's presence ensured swift responses to unforeseen threats. Every step of the campaign reflected lessons learned in the valley: anticipation, readiness, and the unyielding resolve of a commander who had faced near annihilation and survived. The Macedonian army also grew increasingly efficient in its logistics. Supply lines were secured through careful reconnaissance, communication between detachments became streamlined, and the coordination of infantry, cavalry, and engineers reached unprecedented levels of sophistication. These improvements were directly influenced by the memory of the ambush, where delayed reactions and uncertainty could have meant disaster. Alexander's strategies now incorporated contingency planning at every stage, ensuring that even unforeseen attacks could be met with rapid, disciplined response. In towns and cities along the route, Alexander's reputation preceded him. Local leaders, aware of the legendary valley ambush, hesitated to resist openly. Tales of the king's survival circulated widely, fostering both fear and compliance. The psychological edge gained from that single near-death experience proved invaluable. Resistance crumbled not only under military might, but also under the weight of myth and perception. Alexander had turned vulnerability into power, demonstrating that survival in the face of overwhelming odds could shape the entire theater of war. As the campaign pressed further east, the army faced increasingly challenging terrain. Mountain passes, rivers, and deserts tested both endurance and strategy. Yet the principles forged in the valley guided every maneuver. Scouts moved ahead, flanking parties secured high ground, and formations were adjusted to prevent encirclement. Alexander led from the front, his presence inspiring courage and vigilance, his decisions reflecting the understanding that fortune could be merciless and that even the smallest lapse could be fatal. The culmination of these lessons became evident when the Macedonians finally confronted the remaining organized Persian forces. Alexander's approach was both audacious and methodical, a combination sharpened by his near-death experience. Units struck swiftly, commanders executed coordinated maneuvers, and the enemy, hampered by fear of his reputation and the demonstrated discipline of his army, faltered. Victory came not merely from numbers or brute force, but from strategy honed by experience, adaptability born of survival, and psychological mastery forged in the crucible of near annihilation. By the time Alexander's forces reached the easternmost territories of the Persian Empire, the impact of the ambush in the valley had permeated every facet of his campaign. Leadership, strategy, discipline, and the integration of psychological warfare were all indelibly shaped by that narrow escape. The Macedonian army, seasoned by confrontation and survival, had become an instrument capable of decisive action, unflinching even in the face of uncertain danger. The legacy of that day endured in every engagement, every city secured, and every Persian force subdued. Alexander had transformed vulnerability into a lesson in resilience, mortality into strategic insight, and near death into legend. It was a defining crucible in a campaign that would be remembered for centuries, illustrating not only the brilliance of a conqueror, but also the profound influence of peril on the making of history.